You ever spend over a decade building something so stable, so reliable, that people start to think it just runs on its own? That was me. My name is Laurel Kincaid. I am 39 years old, born and raised just outside of Portland, Oregon. For the past 14 years, I was the senior infrastructure architect at a mid-sized tech firm called Halvix Systems. We built deployment automation, vaulting, network resilience, the invisible stuff most people take for granted until it stops working. I loved what I did, not because I needed the praise, but because I knew the stability of the company depended on the quiet work no one saw. That was until Merrick showed up, grinning, clueless, and ready to wreck it all. He showed up in January wearing an ultra-slim gray blazer and sneakers that cost more than my mortgage. Efficiency, scalability, modernization, he kept repeating like a broken buzzword generator. I remember sitting across from him in that first strategy session thinking, this guy does not even know what our infrastructure does, but he sure knows how to criticize it. 14 years of careful design, layering vaults over token logic, isolating backup triggers, even air-gapping some of the more sensitive endpoints, all of it labeled legacy tech before he even looked at the documentation. I smiled, nodded, and made a mental note. If he was going to bulldoze the foundation, he better be ready to live in the rubble. It was Friday, one of those quiet, deceptively calm afternoons where everything feels just a little too still. The meeting ran long, and Dylan kept referring to elevating team agility while glancing at a printed org chart. My name was not on it. Not in the primary structure, not in the dotted line dependencies. I was invisible, erased. At 5:04 p.m., I got the Slack ping. I remember the exact timestamp because I stared at it for a long minute, rereading the message like it might change if I blinked. Your role has been transitioned. It will deactivate your credentials by COAB. That was it. 14 years, and I did not even get a real conversation. Just a cold message, copy-pasted like I was a help desk intern. They thought I would rage, maybe cry. They probably assumed I would beg for a handoff or ask to keep some documentation access. I did none of that. I just closed the laptop, stood up from my home office chair, and walked into the kitchen to pour a glass of red wine. Because here's what they forgot. My architecture did not just run the company, it was the company. And what Dylan never took the time to learn was that every critical pathway in that system had been secured, locked, and double authenticated behind processes that required manual offline keys. Keys only I had. Not because I was power hungry, but because no one else ever wanted the responsibility. Until they fired me. I was not angry. Not in the way people expect. I was insulted. Resentment hit like a cold draft. You give a company 14 years of uptime, disaster recovery planning, invisible miracles, and they hand you a digital pink slip like you were some outdated plug-in. It was not personal, they would say. It was operational necessity. A modern shift. Dylan probably thought he was making bold moves. What he did not know was that boldness without understanding is just stupidity in a blazer. He replaced me with a younger team led by a former intern of mine. Her name was Shelley. She was smart but green, and she had no clue the systems she was inheriting had layers she could not even access, because no one ever asked how those layers worked. They just assumed they always would. So no, I did not lash out. I did not threaten legal action. I did not even reply to the Slack message. What I did do, quietly and methodically, was open a shell terminal and start preparing the last card I had never wanted to play. Not to destroy anything, but to remind them, you do not rip out the foundation and expect the house to stand. I had spent the last year reinforcing every vault, every job runner, every secret store with layers of encrypted logic that could not be reverse engineered by a team that thought GitHub Copilot was a miracle solution. It was not sabotage. It was hygiene. It was math. And when you remove the only person who knows the math behind your digital house, well, you better have flood insurance. People like Dylan believe in dashboards. They think if a chart is green, then everything is fine. They live in metrics. I live in logic. And while he toasted his bold new direction with the board that weekend, I sat in my quiet house, watching the logs slow to a crawl, watching what happens when the heartbeat of the system starts fading. I had not broken a single policy. I had not deleted a single file. All I had done was walk away. And as I closed my laptop, the last thing I said out loud, soft, maybe even a little amused, was, "Good luck, Dylan, you are going to need it." There is a difference between complexity and chaos. One is designed, the other is negligence pretending to be innovation. Dylan Merrick never grasped that. To him, anything that required more than 3 clicks or one dashboard view was outdated. But real infrastructure, the kind that survives blackouts, zero-day exploits, and bad leadership, is not about convenience. It is about durability. And long before he showed up, I had already started planning for a future where someone like him might try to streamline the wrong parts of the system. I just never thought it would come this fast or this carelessly. The changes I made were subtle, quiet, the kind of things no one notices unless they know what they are looking at, and Dylan never did. I began migrating high-risk authentication vaults off the cloud and into cold storage physical devices like my YubiKey, kept in a location that never touched the network. Credentials that used to auto-rotate digitally were moved to a process that required human validation, not to make things harder, but to make them safer. I called it redundancy via realism, because the world does not care about your uptime when your secrets leak in a breach. Redundancy means accepting the messy truth. Sometimes machines need a human gatekeeper. Dylan reviewed one of my backup flowcharts in an all-hands call and said it was unnecessarily intricate. He chuckled when he said it, like I had built a Rube Goldberg machine instead of a fortress. But here is the thing about infrastructure hygiene. It is not about aesthetics. It is about intent. I had built those layers not to confuse anyone, but to make sure that any future change had to pass through more than just a Jira ticket and a Slack notification. You cannot automate trust. Not really. And trust in a zero-trust world means every access path has to be earned again. Every time. Some people think of hygiene as wiping the whiteboard, clearing everything down to the bone so they can start fresh. That is Dylan's way. Erase, replace, deploy. He bragged about a zero-trust architecture in his second week, not realizing that I had implemented most of those principles 5 years earlier, just without the flair or the press release. The difference was, I built them to protect us. He weaponized the term to justify control. What he failed to understand was that every clean room has an exit protocol, and I had built mine very carefully. Not because I planned to leave, but because I knew someday someone might push me out. Underneath the surface, I started restructuring the backup logic. Previously automated fallback routines were rewritten to include manual key inputs. Air-gapped snapshots were re-verified using local hash checks. Even the most basic restoration workflows now needed multi-factor triggers, most of which were tied to devices only I had physical access to. I never hid it. The documentation existed, but like most busy executives, Dylan never bothered to read it. He preferred summaries. I gave him what he asked for, summaries that were technically correct yet entirely useless when push came to shove. Some would call that sabotage. It is not. It is protection. There is a line between creating safety nets and building traps. What I did was hygiene, strategic restraint wrapped in logic. I never changed core access levels without authorization. I never shut anything down. I just removed the crutches people leaned on too often, forcing the team to engage with the systems the way they were meant to, through diligence, through process, not through convenience. Dylan had a habit of saying, if we cannot onboard someone new in under a week, the system is broken. I always found that funny. You can teach someone to drive a car in a day. That does not mean they know how to fix the engine. The problem was not the system. It was that Dylan saw infrastructure like a Lego set, something you build fast, break down fast, and rebuild faster. But I had built something more like a living ecosystem, complex, interdependent, and capable of withstanding failure. Unless, of course, you ignored all the signs and fired the one person who knew where the roots were buried. The final stage of my hygiene protocol was something I called the heartbeat reducer, a lightweight demon that slowed down certain logging systems whenever unauthorized changes were detected. Not to hide anything, but to reduce noise, make intrusion obvious to those who knew how to listen. Dylan did not. His team saw the system behaving a little oddly and assumed it was just latency. They had no idea that the real danger was not lag, it was disconnection. Slowly, over weeks, I had begun decoupling automated trust pathways, not out of malice, out of necessity, because no one respects a locked door until they lose the key. So when they finally cut me loose and assumed the architecture would hum along as usual, I did not gloat. I watched, quietly, and waited. Because when a system is built with real hygiene, it does not explode. It simply stops responding. And by the time you realize it, the silence has already settled in. The first sign of trouble is not always loud. Sometimes it arrives in the form of an email marked Internal Audit Urgent. That is how it started. Dylan, still high on his own reorganization spree, brought in a compliance task force to redocument our infrastructure systems. He called it transparency. I called it theater. The audit team was led by a woman named Hannah Dozier, early 40s, sharp glasses, even sharper tone. Hannah was not new to corporate politics. I could tell right away she was not here to learn. She was here to justify whatever decision Dylan had already made behind closed doors. When they requested full access to the infrastructure map, I paused. Not because I had anything to hide, but because I had everything to protect. Giving audit teams unrestricted access to deeply layered systems without contextual guidance is like handing someone a scalpel with no idea where the arteries are. They do not mean harm, but damage happens anyway. So I did what any seasoned engineer would do when confronted with shallow oversight and rushed timelines. I misdirected, strategically, carefully. I gave them exactly what they asked for, and nothing they needed. I packaged a set of configuration files, clean, safe, and expertly sanitized. Most of them were 6 months old, still functional, still technically accurate, but entirely useless for anyone trying to understand how the deeper logic of the system worked today. I included path aliases instead of real file locations, decoy variable names, and topology graphs with old node clusters that had since been deprecated. All of it was labeled cleanly, documented professionally, and formatted like any internal report would be. If you looked quickly, you would think you had everything. If you tried to deploy something with it, you would hit a wall of unresolved dependencies. Not a single error, just failure to function. It was not sabotage. Sabotage implies malice. This was preservation. I had spent over a decade building a system that was both secure and intuitive for those who took the time to understand it. But Dylan wanted a quick fix, a new team, and a flashy compliance sticker to show the board. That kind of shortcut thinking breaks things. So I let them look, I let them dig, I just made sure they were digging in the wrong place. Hannah was thorough, I will give her that. She ran scripts, cross-checked tables, asked for permission trails. She was hunting for inconsistencies she could report, trying to prove that my processes were outdated. But the irony was, she could not find the flaws because she was never looking at the real system. I had spent years weaving layers into our architecture, not just for performance, but to protect against intrusion. The result? The maps they were auditing were as real as a cardboard set in a theater, convincing from a distance, worthless under stress. I watched as her team tried to trace vault rotations using the logs I had redirected to a dummy endpoint weeks earlier. They pinged token refresh paths that no longer existed, mapped container workflows that had been rerouted, and annotated service accounts that were never meant to exist outside of testing environments. Every question they asked was answered with a pleasant, professional explanation. Legacy configuration, I would say, or that path was deprecated in Q3. Check the updated YAML tree. All of it true, none of it helpful, and all of it buried just deep enough that no one would realize it until I was already gone. There is something you learn after years in ops. Clarity without context is just noise. Dylan wanted documentation, but he did not want understanding. He wanted fast access, not fluency. And fluency, real deep operational fluency, cannot be downloaded. It is learned through failure, problem solving, and time. I had tried to teach it years ago, but few wanted to learn. They wanted magic. They wanted one-click deployment buttons and instant rollback assurance. And when it worked, they thought the system was simple, because I had made it look that way. So when Hannah signed off on the audit report 2 weeks later, noting that documentation was outdated but in progress, I smiled, because I knew exactly what was going to happen. They thought they were ready. They thought they had the keys. But what they had was a paper map of a city that had already been rebuilt underground. And unless I walked them through it personally, they would never find their way back to the surface. The beauty of misdirection is that it only works on people who believe they know more than they do. Dylan and Hannah both believed the system had been cracked open. They thought they were standing in the center of it, but they were still in the lobby admiring the wallpaper. And if the day ever came when I disappeared, they would realize just how far from the core they really were. There is a certain kind of arrogance that comes with assuming you can copy someone else's work and make it run just as smoothly. Dylan's new team was full of that confidence. Young, bright, fast-talking engineers who believed tools could replace experience. They treated my automation flows like they were templates from a public repo. They combed through Jenkins jobs, dug into GitHub actions, and cherry-picked scripts I had written over the course of 14 years. And then, they tried to recreate the machine from the outside in, like watching a magician and thinking they understood the trick. But what they did not realize was that I had not built a system. I had crafted a sequence, modular, interlocked, and deliberately silent when tampered with. They copied just enough to make the dashboard flicker and the job queues light up. But every time they triggered a flow, something quietly broke. No alerts, no red banners, just processes that never resolved, builds that stalled at 73%, containers that spun up, then died in isolation. They never figured out why, because the automation was not just in the code, it was in the behavior. My scripts relied on conditional hooks encrypted by private tokens and time-based secrets that required a physical handshake between systems. Without that handshake, the flows mimicked success while drifting further into a soft failure state. That is the kind of sabotage no one notices, not until Monday. Dylan, as usual, did not ask questions. He was too focused on his infrastructure refresh slides for the next board meeting. From his perspective, the system was running fine. After all, the dashboards were green and no one had complained, yet. What he never grasped was that quiet systems are not always stable ones, especially not mine. I had designed them to fail gracefully, and when misused, they did exactly that. No panic, no errors, just a slow retreat into silence. And when silence stretches long enough, even the confident start to worry. That Friday, around noon, I logged out of the admin shell for the last time. No ceremony, no announcement, just a quiet exit. I revoked every access token tied to my YubiKey, deleted the SSH fingerprint that authenticated my device, and severed the remote key bridge to the vault. That key bridge had been the last piece tethering the core systems to the automated fallbacks I designed. Without it, any attempt to update, rotate, or failover would trigger a need for manual validation, and that validation now lived offline, with me, in a key that never touched the cloud again. People always assume infrastructure lives in the cloud. That is the illusion. In truth, infrastructure lives in the minds of the people who understand it. You can lift code, copy pipelines, even mirror architecture. But unless you understand the logic, the rhythm, the trade-offs, it is just machinery with no soul. Dylan's team never learned that. They thought they could reverse engineer fluency from my commits. But my commits were the surface. The real work was buried in decisions made years ago when no one was looking. By the end of the day, I had disappeared from every team channel. No farewell message, no calendar goodbye, just one less icon in the Slack sidebar. They thought I had moved on. Maybe they even felt relief, but I was not gone, not really. I was watching, waiting, because I knew what was coming. I had seen it before, at another company under another manager who thought access meant ownership. It does not. And the moment you believe it does, the foundation begins to slip. I left one last breadcrumb in the vault log, a timestamp note marked key handshake required, manual confirmation only. I knew no one would read it, not until the moment the system asked for it. And by then, it would be too late. Not because I wanted chaos, but because they needed to understand the cost of ignoring the people who keep the lights on. You cannot clone dedication, you cannot fork intuition, and you definitely cannot automate trust. So when they sat there Monday morning watching Jenkins' job stall and Vault refusing to rotate, they would not see a bug. They would see the truth. The system had not betrayed them. It had simply stopped pretending to trust them. And I had taken the last working key with me, not out of spite, but out of necessity. Because sometimes the only way to prove your value is by vanishing and letting the silence speak. The slowest kind of betrayal is the kind you can see coming and still cannot stop. It starts subtly, Your name left off a calendar invite, a team meeting that suddenly moves without notice, a Slack thread where everyone seems to know something you do not. At first, I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe I had missed the memo. Maybe it was just noise. But then it became unmistakable. My pull requests were no longer being merged. My documentation edits sat unreviewed. The internal changelog no longer mentioned me. I had not gone quiet. They had muted me. Cam Griffin, the only person in cybersecurity who had a spine left, pulled me into a private Zoom late one evening. His face was drawn, lit by the blue hue of 4 monitors and fatigue. He did not even say hello, just leaned in and said, "Just so you know, Dylan rewrote the org chart this morning. SRE is now part of Product Ops. Your name's not on the list." I did not respond right away. I just stared at the screen, trying to decide if I felt more insulted or relieved. "I tried to push back," he added. He said it's a forward-looking structure, whatever that means. It meant I was gone before they even had the courage to tell me. They wanted the infrastructure without the architect, the playbook without the author. They believed they could excise the human parts and keep the machinery running. That is the thing with these corporate cleanouts. They want to erase you gently like brushing dust off a whiteboard. No conflict, no mess. Just gone. Cam ended the call with a quick, "Watch your 6," and logged out. I appreciated it more than he knew. The final slap came the next morning. I sat down with my coffee, opened my laptop, and typed in my Halvix dashboard credentials like I had done for years. But this time, instead of the usual interface, I got a blank gray screen. Centered text. One line, "Access denied." No explanation, no support link. Just a flat rejection, like I had never existed in the system I helped build. I tried logging into the admin panel. Same response. Vault access? Gone. GitHub SSO? Locked. It was surgical, cold, and deliberate. There was no meeting, no debrief, no graceful exit. They ghosted me like a bad date. One minute I was keeping their infrastructure afloat. The next, I was an unperson. It was not about budget. It was not even about performance. It was ego. Dylan wanted a system he could own, not one he inherited, and I represented everything he could not understand. Redundancy planning, zero-knowledge encryption, offline key bridges, real-world paranoia dressed as best practices. To him, that was all legacy clutter. To me, it was the only reason they had not been breached. They thought removing me was a clean break, but in doing so, they left behind 1,000 invisible dependencies. Small scripts still calling my private runners, cron tabs linked to workflows I controlled, vault leases that only I could rekey, the kind of hidden infrastructure that does not show up in an audit report but holds everything together when things go sideways. And because they never asked for a handoff, they never got one. Because they never said goodbye, they never got closure. And because they ghosted me, I let the system do the same to them. What they did not understand was that real infrastructure is more than code and configs. It is relationships between systems, timing, trust, muscle memory. You cannot fake that. You cannot restructure your way around it. And when you try to clone it, all you do is build a paper version of the original. Fragile, inflexible, doomed to fall apart the moment something unexpected happens. I stared at that access denied screen for a while, not because I was surprised, but because I knew what it meant. The final switch had been flipped. The bridges were burned. They had chosen to cut me loose without even looking at what I had been holding up. And now all I had to do was wait. Because somewhere deep in that quiet infrastructure, my code was still ticking, waiting for a condition, a trigger, a silence long enough to wake the next part. Not destruction, not damage, just failure by design, and this time it would not be my name on the postmortem. I never believed in revenge through destruction. There is no power in chaos. It is too obvious, too emotional, and frankly, it is not smart. If you want to make a point in the world of infrastructure, you do not delete. You deconstruct. You leave the shell standing while hollowing out the core. So when the time came, I did not blow anything up. I simply opened my secure terminal, entered my passphrase into a cold sign session, and ran one silent, patient script that had been sitting quietly on my offline drive for over a year. nullroot.sh, one keystroke, no fanfare, just a blinking cursor and a soft hum from the machine as the wheels began to turn. Null root was not a nuclear button. It was a disarmament protocol. It did not wipe data. It did not brick systems. Instead, it methodically revoked auto-renew tokens, disabled all passive API health checks, paused scheduled failovers, and rekeyed the internal secrets vault with entropy too high for brute force and no path for rotation. To the outside observer, everything still looked normal. The dashboard still showed green. The heartbeat check still responded with 200 OK. Jenkins builds were queued. Vault reported healthy. But beneath the surface, the system was quietly suffocating. This was not sabotage. This was insulation. I had designed the script during the early days of Halvix, when I realized that upper management would never fully grasp the fragility of a live system. They only understand what they can see, and dashboards lie, but code does not. So I wrote nullroot not as a weapon, but as a message, a fallback for when the company lost its way and I was no longer trusted to protect what I had built. The logic was clear. If institutional memory became a liability, then institutional reliance had to be withdrawn, silently and completely. The first thing nullroot did was purge every unattended authentication token from the CI/CD pipelines. No more auto-deploy. No more self-renewing credentials. Then it redirected the health check endpoints to a local-only instance, meaning that while internal systems still saw healthy, external monitoring tools were reading data from a loop-back mirror, a kind of puppet show for the ignorant. After that, it triggered the slow rekey of the secrets vault, which required an offline quorum of 3, something only I knew how to initiate. Without it, the vault would refuse all rotations after the final lease expired. And it did all of this with the grace of a ghost. No logs, no traces, just the quiet shuffling of digital furniture, so that by the time they noticed something was wrong, they would not even know where to look. Because the real brilliance of nullroot was not in what it changed. It was in what it left behind. The systems remained intact. The services appeared operational. But like a human body without oxygen, it was only a matter of time before everything stopped responding in ways that mattered. I sat back and watched the final logs roll in. Nullroot had completed its run in under 7 minutes. No alerts were triggered, no anomalies flagged. Not one member of Dylan's shiny new product ops team would notice a thing, until the next deployment failed, or a secrets rotation timed out, or a dashboard started flickering without reason. And when that happened, they would follow the usual protocol. They would escalate to infrastructure. They would ping my old handles. They would call Cam, who would shrug and say, "She's gone." And then the panic would begin. Because Dylan and his team never really understood what held their system together. They thought it was software, pipelines, scripts. It was not. It was knowledge, sequencing, intuition built from long nights of fire drills, false alarms, and forgotten dependencies. You cannot inherit that from a wiki. You cannot reverse engineer it from a log, and you certainly cannot fake it in front of a production incident. What I had done with nullroot was not revenge. It was a controlled collapse, a way to show them what they had lost, without breaking a single policy or crossing a legal line. Because at the end of the day, they had every right to remove me. That was their choice, but they had no idea what they were choosing to live without. And now they would get to find out. Not all at once, but slowly, quietly, as each system, one by one, began to ask for a key that no longer existed in their world, only in mine. It started just after 8 a.m., though I had already been up for hours, sipping coffee on my back porch while reading the system logs on my private dashboard. By 8:12, Halvix Systems was dead quiet. From the outside, it looked like the power had been cut to a skyscraper. Lights on, but no one home. The internal VPN tunnel refused to handshake. Jenkins builds began queuing and then freezing. The CRM dashboard, which executives watched religiously, was blank white with a spinning loader wheel. One of the interns, probably panicked, sent a Slack message to Donner DevOps asking if something was down. The message did not send. Because Slack? That was hosted internally, and it was down too. I wish I could say I smiled. I did not exactly. What I felt was something colder, quieter, not satisfaction, not pride, something like vindication, because it had not taken weeks or months for them to feel my absence. It had taken 2 days. 2 business days for every redundant system I had designed to reveal just how non-redundant they were without the person who built them. Dylan had stripped me out of the system like I was a bad patch. What he failed to realize was that I was the operating layer. Dylan's Monday morning began with frantic pings and an emergency calendar invite titled War Room, All Hands Urgent. From what Cam later told me, it was chaos. Engineers scrambled to trace system logs but could not authenticate. The backup dashboards linked to deprecated URLs. The vault refused all secret fetches. The CI/CD toolchains had failed their last heartbeat checks and now sat in indefinite cooldown. Dylan, red in the face, demanded a full rollback, except there was nothing to roll back to. Everything pointed to one central truth: the infrastructure was no longer responsive, because it was no longer connected to anyone with permission to control it. They tried rebooting the build server manually, but the startup scripts had been rewritten to require a YubiKey challenge, offline only, my YubiKey, not stored on any server, not mirrored, not copied, not guessed. And unlike password-based keys, you cannot just call IT and reset it. It is physical, tangible, and gone. Dylan's team scoured the documentation only to find what I had intended them to find. Beautiful diagrams, perfect syntax, flawless outlines, just vague enough to mislead, just detailed enough to seem complete. They thought they had blueprints. What they had were blue smoke trails. I am told that by 10 a.m., Dylan had gone from loud and bullish to visibly shaken. He stood at the whiteboard in the main conference room drawing dependency chains with a dry erase marker, demanding someone get infrastructure back online. But no one knew how. His people were cloud fluent, sure, but they had never run through a real outage drill. They had never experienced a cascading failure in a production vault. They did not even know which system booted first when everything else failed. At some point, he called Cam into the room. Cam, who knew better than to speak too freely, simply said, "We need Olivia. She has the cold key." That was the moment it hit him. I wasn't just the architect, I was the root trust, and he had cut me out without so much as a handshake or a knowledge transfer. He had deleted the one person who could have fixed all of it with a 2-minute terminal command. And now, even if they wanted me to return, it would not be simple. Because Nullroot had fully decoupled all auto-healing routines. There was no snapback, no reboot. The system wasn't broken, it was waiting. The irony? Dylan had once bragged during a lunch meeting that no single point of failure should ever be a person. He had made it a slide in his quarterly deck, but what he didn't understand, and what Halvix learned that morning, is that trust is a system. And like any system, if you do not maintain it, it degrades. He had turned me into a ghost, thinking he could inherit what I knew without paying attention to how I knew it. He wanted control. What he got was silence. And that silence would grow louder with every hour, every missed call, every unanswered ping, every transaction that failed to sync. The system hadn't crashed. It had gone dormant, waiting for the one thing they no longer had access to: me. By noon on Monday, Halvix Systems was in full-blown chaos mode. Not your usual high-priority ticket kind of chaos. This was nuclear. Senior engineers sat in tense silence with their hands hovering over keyboards, staring at systems that looked alive but refused to respond. Dylan's face was flushed, his collar wrinkled from tugging it every few minutes, and his voice had gone from loud to hoarse. He thought the team could brute force their way through my absence. But tech does not run on brute force. It runs on context, and that context had just walked out the front door on Friday evening with her head held high and her keys still in her pocket. They started with the documentation I had left behind. Dozens of pages, color-coded flowcharts, credentials policies, protocol maps, and fallback scenarios. It looked professional, comprehensive even, but everything had a catch. The node IDs were aliases, the vault paths were shifted by variables, the flow sequences had dependencies abstracted into helper layers that only I could interpret. To anyone else, it was like having the map to a maze without knowing where the entrance was. As Dylan flipped through pages, he barked, "There has to be something in here." But the deeper they searched, the more frustrated they became. When the first junior dev tried to override the vault daemon with root escalation, the system responded immediately, not with access, but with retaliation. The attempt triggered a silent defense script I had installed over a year ago. Within seconds, their IP was blacklisted from all internal systems. A few moments later, every single login request from that subnet was redirected to a dummy environment I had spun up months ago. A mirror of the real thing, except it did nothing but record activity. Every keystroke, every attempted bypass, every command issued. They thought they were fixing things. What they were doing was handing me a digital play-by-play of their panic in real time. Dylan was not used to losing control. He paced the floor, snatching reports out of people's hands, demanding someone just roll back everything to Friday's state. But my systems were not built for rollback. They were built for resilience. And when you cut out the person holding the keys to that resilience, you do not get a crash, you get a slow death. One error at a time. One failed handshake, one unreachable service. Until finally, someone asked the one question nobody wanted to hear. What's the protocol for total outage? That is when they opened the red binder. The Halvix disaster recovery plan was a physical document, old-fashioned maybe, but deliberate. You do not want your recovery plan locked behind the very system that failed. So I made sure it was printed, updated quarterly, and stored in a fireproof cabinet near Dylan's office. They found it. They opened it. And right there on page 1, in bold font, it read, "Recovery requires physical access to the offline security token held by the senior infrastructure lead, Laurel Kincaid." The room went dead silent. Dylan clenched the binder so hard the pages crinkled. "Where is she?" he asked. No one answered. Cam knew, of course he knew, but he was not about to stick his neck out for a man who had ignored every warning and steamrolled the only person who could have prevented this exact disaster. Dylan demanded someone contact me. I did get the call, but not from him. Cam sent me a text. "They're finally reading the binder. Your name dropped on page 1. I did not respond. Not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. This was not some petty revenge stunt. I had built those systems to survive, but they were never designed to survive leadership that treated trust like an afterthought. Dylan had gambled that infrastructure could be handed off like a playbook. What he did not understand is that real infrastructure, resilient infrastructure, is not a thing. It is a relationship, one between the system and the human who knows how it breathes. And now the system was holding its breath, waiting. By Wednesday afternoon, word had spread that Halvix's CEO, Nolan Reyes, had cut his trip short and was already en route from London. He had tried logging into his company-issued MacBook for a quarterly earnings check-in and got stuck at the startup keychain unlock screen. When he called the help desk, they politely told him the system was undergoing full-cycle stabilization, which is a fancy way of saying no one knew what was going on. But the kicker? His badge would not even open the front door when he arrived Thursday morning. That is when the silence ended and the reckoning began. Nolan was not the kind of executive who screamed. He did not need to. He walked through chaos with a calm so sharp it made people shrink just by proximity. By 9:00 a.m., he was seated in the executive boardroom with a decaf espresso and a blank notepad, asking simple, lethal questions. Who holds the vault key? Why are authentication tokens expired? Why are our backups unreachable? Dylan tried answering, but it was clear even to the interns that he was drowning. So he launched into a slideshow, literally. A 5-slide deck titled Infrastructure Resilience, Legacy Bottlenecks, and Modernization Gaps. It was pathetic. Dylan blamed everything except himself. Unscalable architecture. Inherited friction. Legacy privilege assignments. He used the word legacy 9 times in under 4 minutes, trying to turn my name into a problem without actually saying it. He was throwing jargon at a man who knew when someone was tap dancing around failure. Nolan let him finish, then quietly asked, "If this was so fragile, why did it run flawlessly for 14 years until last Friday?" The room was silent. That afternoon, Halvix brought in a third-party digital forensics firm, Blackridge Technologies, a firm I had recommended years ago when we had a minor intrusion scare. Funny how that came full circle. The lead consultant was a woman named Priya Dunn, sharp as a tack and allergic to nonsense. She had the logs decrypted and lined up within hours. Every token call, every failed login attempt, every rerouted command. She traced the exact moment the remote access bridge was severed and followed the chain all the way back to a single change request approval. Dylan's approval, time-stamped, unsecured. She gave her summary to the board in plain terms. The infrastructure behaved exactly as designed, redundant, resilient, and protected. The only failure was human and managerial. Dylan tried to object, but he was already done. By Thursday morning, security walked him out of the building. He did not even get a chance to grab his backup drive. Cam told me he stared straight ahead, red in the face, while the receptionist avoided eye contact and his team pretended to type on dead dashboards. He never said a word. Later that evening, Cam called me. They canned him, he said. CEO wanted it quiet, just HR, legal, and a box of his things. Except he didn't even take the box. I did not say much. I just listened. It was not joy I felt. It was a strange kind of balance. Not vengeance, but correction. Because people like Dylan always believe the structure will bend to their ego. But systems do not lie. They reflect. And Halvix systems had reflected back every bad decision, every ignored warning, every cut corner. Loudly, publicly. The board issued an internal memo calling it an unexpected but instructive operational event. Nolan called it avoidable. And me? I was still watching from a distance, the UB keys still on my desk, untouched. Because while they scrambled, blamed, and burned hours of reputation trying to undo the fallout, I had already moved on. My name was still on the disaster recovery plan, but now it was also on a signed offer letter from a firm that valued architects over architect slayers. One that saw through the buzzwords to the blueprint underneath. Justice, it turns out, does not always wear a robe. Sometimes it walks out the front door with a cardboard box and a forgotten login. Nolan called me on a quiet Sunday afternoon. No assistant, no calendar hold. Just a direct call from the CEO's personal line. I knew it was coming. He thanked me for the integrity of the design, for the clarity of the recovery path, and for my deep commitment to operational discipline. His words were careful, measured. Then he offered me a 6-month consulting contract to re-stabilize the system I had built. I paused for a second, just long enough to let him wonder, then smiled and said, "Thank you, Nolan, but I am already building something else now." And I meant it. I had taken an offer from a cybersecurity startup based in Austin called Chainroot. They were small, lean, and sharp. Their founder, Tamara Kinley, told me in our first conversation, "We do not want resumes, we want scars." That was the first time in years I felt like someone saw me. Not the title, not the years, not the metrics. Just me. So I packed up my Seattle apartment, shipped my UB keys in a Faraday pouch, and started fresh. No corporate fluff, no strategy decks, just code, clarity, and people who listened. Still, the story stayed with me, the way it all unraveled at Halvix. Not because I was bitter, but because I knew it would happen again somewhere else to someone else, unless the lesson was written down. So I wrote it anonymously. I posted it as a long-form piece on my old Substack titled, "The Cost of Forgetting Your Builders." I was deliberate. I did not name names. I changed locations, technologies, even the company structure. But the heart of it, that was real. I described the erosion of trust, the weaponization of jargon, the danger of erasing institutional memory just to make room for buzzwords. Within 2 days, the post hit the front page of Hacker News. By day 4, it was being reposted on LinkedIn with quotes like, "This is why DevOps is broken, and every CTO should read this twice." Several CISOs I used to admire, people I had only ever known through conferences and Slack channels, shared it with comments like, "Whoever wrote this, thank you." I even saw a screenshot of it inside a keynote slide at a cloud security summit in San Francisco. My inbox quietly filled with messages. Some guessing it was me, some asking to republish, some just saying, "I felt seen." Halvix never responded publicly, but I heard through Cam that the board circulated it internally under the subject line, "Lessons in Risk Management." Dylan's name came up exactly once, in a footnote, under "Poor Architectural Understanding." A perfect summary, and yet I felt no glee, no smugness. That was never the point. I did not burn anything down. I just made sure no one could mistake my silence for permission. They had wanted a system they could control without understanding. I gave them that. And when they failed to hold it, I gave them nothing. Exactly what they asked for. Chainroot gave me a team again, people who trusted me to lead, to architect, to break things thoughtfully and rebuild them stronger. I started working on a self-healing vault orchestration layer, one that learns human patterns and flags disruptions before a system cracks. It was elegant, efficient, and most of all, it was mine. No approval needed, no legacy label slapped across my work, just impact. Looking back, the ending was not explosive. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm, when the air clears and you can finally hear yourself think. I never set out to destroy Halvix. I did not have to. They did that on their own. I simply protected my design, the way any good engineer would. With discipline, with foresight, with boundaries. Revenge is overrated, but accountability, that sticks. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can say to a sinking ship is nothing at all.